I'm really thrilled today to be kind of kicking off this conversation with Graham Flack. Graham really needs no introduction, but I will give him just a brief one, and then we'll get into it. The basic story with Graham is that if there's been a major crisis in Canada, he's been at the center of it within our public service. He was central on the national security file after 2001. He was there for international finance for 4 years during the global financial crisis. And now he is the deputy minister at ESDC, of course, a ministry which is really at the core of the government's very large-scale response to what's going on with all the labor disruption, the economic disruption, this kind of medically induced coma into which we've put our economy. So Graham's going to join us today. The order of operations, I'm just waiting for him to come on screen here. I think what the order of operations are that I've got some questions for Graham. We're going to have a conversation really for the next half an hour or so. And I invite you to send in questions for Graham about things he talks about and about the big files with which he deals. I will just say kind of one thing by way of process, and that's that it's a real honor and a real pleasure for us to have a privilege to have with us a deputy minister who's right at the core of this. Of course, it's a funny position to be in as a deputy minister because you're right in the middle of, in this case, some of the biggest political and policy debates and issues that are facing our country right now. But you're also not in a position to be offering the advice in public that you give to ministers in private. So I really want us to get the most out of Graham and respect the really privileged position that he's in and the position that we're in. That's the very privileged position we're in to have him here today. So Graham, I see you on screen. Can you hear me?
I can, although I lost you for a bit, but I'm back.
Well, I was saying great things about you. So, listen, let's start off on what your life was like on March 15th. I'll just tell you quickly what my life was like. I was in Mexico with my family on March 11th, and we flew home from vacation just under the wire. March 12th, I was supposed to fly to McGill that day, the next morning, to give a talk. All of that ended within 2 days. So, at one point, public events were going to be canceled, and everything was canceled. And by March 15th, I was cleaning out my office at the university with the expectation that we weren't going to be back there for a long time. That's a little trivia about my life, but everything seemed to change really quickly. What was your life like on March 14th? What was it like on March 15th? And what's it been like since then?
So, although we'd activated our emergency operations plan prior to then, I guess the big thing that people want to talk about, the income support side, we didn't actually see any movement. And this is where the crisis was just astounding in its speed. And that's said as somebody who spent 4 years doing the international job at the Department of Finance during the global financial crisis. So maybe I tell the story in numbers. So we get daily totals on how many EI claims we get. So Monday morning, March the 16th, we would have had the claims from Friday, March the 13th. And they were perfectly normal, 9,000 claims, maybe a tad higher than the week before average, 7, 8, 9,000 claims a day. Tuesday morning when we got the numbers, we had that Monday, March the 16th, 71,000 claims. Now, just to put that in context, the worst day in the history of the EI system in terms of number of claims came at the height of the global financial crisis, and we had 38,000 claims in one day. And Monday, we had that first day, the 16th, we had 71,000 claims, which continued to climb until March the 24th, when we hit 267,000 claims in a single day. So to put that in context for folks, that would be 35 times normal daily volume, 7 times the record we had ever experienced in the EI system. And that one day, March 24th would have represented probably a month and a half's work in terms of our normal intake on processing. So what was so astonishing about the crisis was with the speed with which those numbers shifted, and the speed with which we were going to have to change the system, because processing what has become probably 3.5 million people who qualify for employment insurance, that's almost 2 years of intake for us. But that's what's emerged over the crisis, and most of that emerged over the first few weeks. So it meant we had to go from March the 18th, the Wednesday, when we had the second day of these catastrophic numbers, to going literally into the ministers that morning, briefing on how we had to radically pivot the EI system towards a different system, of which we had only the beginnings of a plan. And by April the 2nd, we had actually started paying people under the new system. It's quite a kind of astonishing period that over 2 weeks, we were able to stand up the CERB, provide payments to Canadians within days, as opposed to what would have been months in the system. So it's been quite a ride, Peter, but really proud of what people have been able to accomplish.
I want to go back to the global financial crisis in a minute, but before I do that, because I want to get a sense of what this looks like compared to that from a policy process perspective. But before we do that, can you walk me through kind of what the roller coaster was like for those 3 weeks? And what I really am interested in hearing about, I'm interested in hearing about a lot of things, but what I'm interested in hearing about is not maybe the tension, but the dual process of setting out kind of what you think is good policy for this in some ways, in terms of the theory of it and what's possible. Because clearly, it seems to me that you understood immediately that you had to get money into pockets of people right away. You had to do it as quickly as possible, go households and go big. How quickly you can do that, obviously, there are some operational constraints on that. So what was the rub there as you were thinking about what was good policy versus what was possible policy?
So let me just, and most of us probably participating in this conference are in the policy wonk category, which is we think about policy. And if I could share a hubris, I think that many of us in that community share, it's that if we can only dream up an interesting solution to how to solve a problem, surely those operations people can just kind of make all this stuff happen, right? And if I have one lesson I'd hope all of us learn from this, is that the people who saved Canadians in terms of being able to get the money out the door quickly with a new program were not the policy minds around on this teleconference. They were the operations people who were actually able to do amazing things with a system that we don't pay enough attention to. So the EI system is a 46-year-old COBOL-based system. Highly inflexible. When we make changes to the EI system, because it is a layered system with multiple things that have been built over the years to it, it generally takes us between 9 and 24 months, depending on how significant the change is, to make the changes to the system, because we have to literally test end to end all of the challenges that may go wrong. So operationally, what happened was we needed a solution that was going to be very straightforward, attestation-based system, which is what we went with the CERB, was going to be a flat rate. There was no ability to vary that rate for all the nice things we'd like to do in a normal income support system, because that's operationally what we could manage. And I think coming out of the crisis, so in a sense, there wasn't a tension, because we knew the alternative, both for EI in terms of the time it would take to process, but also in terms of people who weren't eligible for EI, if we went with a more complex system, would be that we would have results delivered for Canadians months and months and months later. So really the operations drove here this very straightforward policy solution that we had to go with. But I guess my plea for all of us in the policy space would be sort of theorizing about what interplanetary travel will look like and what we can do when we get to the other planets is a wonderful thing. But when we tell the folks in the engine room, can you guys just go away and build a starship with warp drive? Like, that must be pretty easy to do. Because I've caught this great idea on where we're going to go and how we're going to do it. I really think we have to pay a lot more attention to operations. Because there are massive operational limitations to some of the complex ideas we policy people like to foist upon the operations folks.
You know, there's the old, it's very good. You know, there's the old adage, you know, how did you go bankrupt? You know, slowly at first and then all of a sudden. Um, I'm wondering if you can compare this. I shouldn't have brought up the word bankruptcy, but I wonder if you can compare this to the GFC, because I think the thing that we forget about the global financial crisis is that it actually took a while to unfold, right? That there was a lot of softness in equity markets. There were some problems with different collateralized instruments. Some banks failed, but it didn't all happen in a week. It actually took quite a bit of time. Even the federal government's response, right? I mean, people will recall that we had an election in the middle of the global financial crisis. We could somehow manage that, and then the response really came late in that calendar year, earlier in the next year. Whereas it seems that this all happened very quickly. Now, we can argue about whether we knew there was going to be a pandemic more quickly enough and what the kind of economic impacts were going to be. But really, there's a strange disease in Wuhan, China, and 2 months later, we're shutting down the whole economy. What are the differences in terms of pace of policy making, you know, sense of history, sense of gravity between now and what you saw during the GFC? And what does it tell us kind of about the capacity of government to make policy? I guess the final thing I'll ask is, I mean, how much were those experiences that people hold personally from the GFC influencing the way policy was getting made now?
My mother's reflection would be, you shouldn't send me to a department that has these major potentials for things to go wrong about a year before. That her view is, within about a year of my arrival, catastrophe hits. So Mark Carney recruited me to go to finance to do the international job in 2006, at a time when, as my mother said, her RSPs in the world economy were doing great. And it took about a year, but then it unfolded. And so when I came here, her worry was actually for the pension system, which She knew we have at ESDC. So she's happy that I haven't cratered that system, but not so happy about what's happened to the EI system. So that's the first lesson, I guess, is I'm bad news if you send me to places. But the GFC did play out very differently in multiple phases. So we had initial murmurings, and in fact in Canada, among the initial ones, where some of the exotic financial instruments were not finding markets for them, and we had to find ways to deal with that. But you're right, there were these phases of, there was a financial crisis and a liquidity crisis, relatively clear early on what needed to be done, hard politically to get agreement around those things. But there was a big lag between that and the impact on the real economy. And then a third wave later, when you had a kind of sovereign debt crisis playing back and through it. But at a lot of levels, it was a conventional crisis. They're always a little bit different in how they do it, but you have to deal with the financial effects and create confidence financial system. You have to deal with the real economy effects, but again, in a way that's rather conventional. You stimulate, and the government did massive stimulus around there. So it was stressful. How you were going to get agreement around the issues was difficult. But I think the pathways on what broadly we needed to do were clearer. With this crisis, I'd say the speed is utterly without parallel. We have never seen this many jobs come out of the economy this quickly, in part because our own legislative and health advice actions around the world have caused this to happen in a very short period, as they should have, right? So the speed with which you saw the dislocation of the labor force is utterly unprecedented, even when you compare it to the Great Depression. The speed is astronomical. But the other thing is, the coming out on the other side of this is much more complicated. It's not going to be a snapback economic recovery. There's going to be starts and stops. There are going to be different sectors that are going to come at different paces. There's massive uncertainty around this. And I'd add to this the kind of structural elements about, is the crisis itself going to disrupt behavior in terms of, are people in the long term going to be willing to travel as much? Will that sector be permanently disrupted, et cetera? So I would say the speed with this is utterly without comparison to the global financial crisis. But the uncertainty about exactly where we should be going and how we should deal with things, including if there's a stimulus phase, is that actually a problem, given that you've got what is fundamentally a different kind of shock than is in a traditional crisis? this uncertainty is much higher than I've dealt with in other crises.
This is very interesting. I mean, what I'd like you to talk about is is a little bit about that uncertainty. I mean, I imagine, I know you're planning for all sorts of scenarios, right? But kind of broadly speaking, I mean, what are the paths look like, or what should we be thinking about as policymakers when we think about sort of two potential paths? So one is, you've put the economy into a medically induced coma, but the analogy is a bad one, because you can turn it back on and there's no lags, there's no side effects. We all go back to the jobs we had before. We go back to our offices and we just kind of slowly get things built up again as we figure out how to get people close to one another. The other one is that there's enough businesses that have closed. There's enough people that have decided to fundamentally reshape their operations, some using AI and automation, others just downsizing, others offshoring some of their tasks. That there's actually not jobs for 20% of people to return to, for example, and there's going to be a lot of churn. What are the kinds of things that policymakers should be thinking about in those two scenarios, and how do those different possibilities kind of guide the policies you're making? I mean, are you trying to just split it down the middle and run the average of those, or are you setting up policy instruments for both?
Yeah, so I think anytime we're faced with this kind of breadth of potential outcomes in kind of a classic scenario planning way, what we shouldn't be trying to do is do the scenario planning to come to a conclusion of, so this is the most likely scenario, so this is what we should plan for. I think given the band of uncertainty that I hope we all would agree is there, it's critical that we actually design policy frames that will be able to support multiple potential outcomes, because we can't confidently predict what the outcomes are going to be. So among the things I think we have to plan for is clearly what's been demonstrated in the crisis is, and if we get second waves or third waves of the pandemic, is you may see rapid dislocation from the labor force with need for income support in real time in ways we've never historically dealt with before. And that instrument is going to be important to have. I think it's going to be very difficult for us to know to what extent are people going to be relieved as the restrictions come off and get back to normal economic behaviors, or to what extent are they going to fundamentally alter their economic behaviors? Could there be sectors that are fundamentally disrupted, in which case workers there may be waiting for a return to economic activity that is never going to return to the baseline that it was at before. That speaks, I think, to the need to have high levels of ability for people to retrain, to be able to move to different sectors and fluidity in the market, but all without having a very clear, it's obvious that this is happening and you need to shift from here to here. But I'd even come down to the fundamentally human behavioral elements of how many of us we've had a group of us stay in the office, so I haven't been working from home, but we went from having at ESDC on any given day 300 to 400 people working remotely from home, to we regularly are at 24,000 people working from home on a system that wasn't built for that. Like, whoever thought, why would you give people laptops if they were doing EI claims processing? Because obviously we're never going to let anyone do EI claims processing from their home. And we've had to equip people instantly to know how to do that. I think the human behavioral impacts here about how many of those employees, and we're serving them, would prefer to work from home. How many cannot wait to get back to work? What's the workplace of the future that's going to look different? And think about the structural impacts of that on our transportation systems, on a public transit, on the ecosystem that feeds a workforce that's largely in the office. There are so many uncertainties around how this is potentially going to unfold that I think this is a time where policymakers need to develop a very rich and nimble policy set that can deal with these multiple scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, on this last point in particular, it strikes me as very interesting that there probably hasn't been a time, I imagine, where your department, which is a very, very important one, would have so much influence on other departments, just in the following sense, right? That you're going to choose a set of policy tools that at much more than the margin may encourage people to stay home to work, or may encourage them to go into work, right? May encourage them to move into flex work arrangements, or may encourage them to work in, back to traditional work weeks. How it's going to interact with childcare is really going to matter. all these things we do that are kind of medium range, medium term or long term planning, as you say, transportation, childcare, training, all the other things that are kind of implicitly built into the world of work that we all live in, they're all up for grabs, it seems, right? Depending on what this recovery looks like. If we move to a world in which most people are working from home for most of the week, a lot of variables change in the models for what we need in terms of our telecommunications and our transportation. So it seems like it's a department now that's got, even if it ever had, it always had huge externalities, but now it's got even bigger ones in terms of the influence it's going to have in other policy areas. I'm interested in hearing, if we have time at the end, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on, just as a manager, how you deal with 27,000 people working from home, or 24,000 people working from home, rather than being in the office. But I want to ask you one kind of higher level question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. And that is that what seems very clear to me from the data and from intuition as well is that there's been a real uptick in people's sense that government can do something, and the government ought to be a backstop in our society. As it turns out, colleagues and I were actually surveying people in 15 European countries when the pandemic hit. And if you look at pre and post lockdown in those countries that did lock down their economies, trust in government went up measurably in these places. People saw government was doing something, right? And that's really powerful at a time when we're trying to retrain labor and we're trying to set up our society for the future. Do you think this belief in government ability can be sustained? And what are the things that government's got to do over the next 6 months, 12 months to kind of demonstrate the role that it's playing in a positive way, to try to, if you think this is a goal of government, to try to sustain this heightened belief that government can be a force for good, and it can be even a necessary force in times like these?
Well, I guess I chose this profession because I fundamentally believe in public service, and that serving your citizens is a noble calling. And for the employees of this department, we all take tremendous pride in what people have been able to do during the crisis. So for me, it's not about sustaining public support for the purpose of sustaining public support. It's that we're here delivering services to Canadians in a way they expect us to do, to serve them with excellence, to serve them efficiently. And I think what the crisis highlighted for them is how that's not a given, as they saw around the world. It's tricky to do that. But I think internally, I go back to my original point about operations. I wouldn't want anyone to take for granted here that we've been able to manage these initial phases because of extraordinary investments we had made in our systems that allowed us to nimbly operate. In fact, we haven't made the investments we need over a generation. But it is like, you think of the classic kind of Canadian notion of peace, order, and good government. I think it's built in our ethos that Canadians believe an important part of our essence as a country is that we're going to have good government that's efficient. So I did bring on an email I wouldn't mind reading, because this is to me like we hit peak Canadian in the crisis about 3 weeks in, because there was some media done about how we were able to get income payments out so quickly when others weren't. So let me just read it. Now, this is based on an article that was in the Toronto Star, and it was written to the person in our organization who really played a central role in holding the system together. So he says, "Dear Cliff, I just read today's article in the Toronto Star and wanted to express my gratitude to you and your colleagues for the extraordinary and selfless efforts you've made during these critical times. During the 40+ years that Rush toured worldwide, we were always so proud of our Canadian roots, and it swells my heart with pride to read of the enormous commitment to the Canadian community you all make to promptly providing desperately needed financial aid to those who are suffering. You are indeed everyone's heroes. Respectfully, Alex Lifeson." So like that, I think we bought another month of people sleeping at work and just constantly keeping the systems going, because like Canada's iconic rock band wrote to these people in our machine room who made this all happen and said, like, you delivered when we needed it, right? So I know, and I'm sure the questions are going to get, as I would expect, into the policy questions of what are the policy instruments we need, what are the policy flexibilities. But if I can leave one plea, Peter, in this part of the conversation, it's we need to equip our operators in all parts of government with the tools, the actual tools, to be able to deliver in a nimble and efficient way. And governments across Canada have historically underinvested in these tools. So it's a miracle what these folks have been able to pull off during the crisis, but we don't want it to be a miracle next time. We want to make those investments so that we have flexible, nimble, modern tools that will allow us to do this more seamlessly and easily, and to open the policy conversation with a wider variety of choices than we had at the front end of the crisis, because we couldn't introduce all of those classic elements of an income support system.
That leads right into my next question. But I mean, I'm just while we're in the process of dropping names of people from Rush, I literally told someone this morning a story about running into Geddy Lee at a street corner in Melbourne once, and him being shocked that someone from Toronto was standing there next to him. On this, let's do a bit of blue skying here. If we were rebuilding the EI system, kind of from the bottom up, from a technical perspective, right? What things would we want to be capturing as we're thinking about EI allocations and income support that we're not capturing now around, records of employment, hours worked, income? I mean, what things are we missing that could really help us build out an income support system for the future, and that could maybe even be the foundation of something bigger if we wanted to, move out of an EI model into a more broadly constituted income support model?
Well, one of, I think the fundamental attributes of an income support system have remained the same over time, which is you want real-time information that allows you to adjust people's incomes in response to shocks that they face to their working incomes in ways that incentivizes their return and supports their return to work as quickly as possible. Those are the attributes of a modern system, and indeed of the original system that we put in place. So among the instruments you would add to facilitate that would be, for example, electronic payroll records that allow you in an automated and seamless way to have information. So to give an example right now, while we have folks on the CERB, we estimate 3.5 million people who are going to be eligible to return to EI when the CERB comes to an end, and the government just announced a 2-month extension. We've got over 5 million records of employment in the system, and one of the reasons that just doesn't automatically and seamlessly allow us to process is there's all kinds of problems with those records. They're kind of introduced with errors. So a modern e-payroll system that in a seamless way, as Australia and the UK have, allow you to get access to what's happened to people's income is going to be important. But I think one of the other gaps we may want to get to in the Q&A is there are folks, the largest portion of CERB recipients that aren't EI eligible are self-employed people. They are not part of modern income support systems anywhere in the world. Very different category of individuals, very different to capture. There isn't a kind of real-time income feed for them. But in the crisis, what we've seen is Canadians felt we needed to support that group of individuals as well. They have not been part of income support systems, and there are real design challenges around how one would do that. So that's another challenge I think we're going to have to address. But just to close on this one, Peter, we have actually made investments towards a modern system. We were going to start building that modern system starting in 2021 and 2022. It'll be an enormous project to put all of our income support systems, including CPP-OAS and EI, which together amount to about 5.5% of Canada's GDP that we move every year through those systems. We did have a backup because there was a concern that just given these volumes, the EI system may go down, and CRA, which was going to deliver part of the CERB, did not know if their volume, they would be able to handle the millions in volumes. So we radically accelerated that first week in March, the work we had on this new modern system. And indeed, one of the benefits the government announced, a Fisher's benefit that will be paid. Our expectation is we are actually going to be able to pay that benefit on this new modern system, which we've been able to stand up in about 14 weeks. I can't promise we'll have the entire new modern income support system in 14 months, but we are definitely building towards that.
I want to ask you another question that's a kind of one level above this, and really respecting your ability to talk about policies that are being considered. Just from a global perspective, is your sense that we're moving closer or farther away from kind of a basic personal income framework, or a universal basic income framework here? Seems to me there's a couple of things pushing in that direction. People are seeing the government can do it. The things that are pushing against it are that we really don't have, for example, there's not a negative income tax element built into this. People are, in a sense, kind of just getting the money. They'll be taxed back, but it's not kind of linked into other income. And we do have a bit more of a patchwork, right? That this program's put in place, and then we've built another thing on top of it, a Fisher's benefit, employee wage support. So it looks universal, but it's not, right? Those are my very kind of scattered observations about it. But is your sense here that when we come out the other side of this thing, that from a policy perspective, there'll be more of an appetite or less of an appetite for a universal basic income?
I'll need to be careful here because this is obviously a live policy debate, but let me just make some observations around UBI. The first observation would be there is no jurisdiction, national or subnational, in the world that has deployed a UBI at scale. Indeed, there have been some pilots, the most recent in Finland, but even the pilot was stopped short 2 years into the full 3-year pilot. So that's observation one, which is there aren't living laboratories in other countries that have actually deployed this. Notwithstanding the fact that you could argue that UBI traces its origins at least back to Thomas More's Utopia. So this isn't a new idea for public policy, but one that hasn't been fully deployed. A second observation is when I went back to the core attributes of a modern income support system, incentive to work is one of the core pillars of that system. And so that would always have to be taken into consideration. And I guess the third point I make is in most UBI systems, what is conceived of is a radical simplification of the supports that are provided to individuals through a single income transfer. And therefore, the elimination of the need to have all these complicated programs, which in Canada, of course, are largely delivered at the provincial level, which complicates things much further in Canada. I would point out, for example, if you're a disabled person who has exceptionally high needs in terms of equipment, et cetera, those highly specialized support programs don't necessarily, if they get converted into a common universal basic income for you, provide the kind of tailored supports you need. So what I just observed is many of these supports provided by provinces are actually designed to respond to very, very tailored and specific needs of individuals. And so a universal benefit, while it seems cleaner and simpler, may disadvantage some of those individuals or not. So those are some of the design considerations I think people would have to take into consideration in addition to fiscal cost of the benefit. But in Canada, what it would mean is a very intensive set of negotiations between federal and provincial governments around how to deal with those kind of things.
I have one more question for you. Now you've been through a few of these crises before. Your hair isn't gray enough to believe that, but I've seen your CV, so it's true. What is our public service missing in terms of what it needs more of to get through these crises, and what are the things that happens to be really good at? And I don't want you to tell tales out of school, but I want to get a sense of, as we think about the public service of the future, at the level of public servants, at the level of the whole system, what is it that we need to take our policy making to the next level? And what is the thing that we're doing really well that Canadians may not be aware of?
So I will re-echo my original plea to all of us policy people who are on the line right now, which is every time we are putting forward policy ideas, I want all of us to say, is this operationally feasible? Have we equipped our operations people with the tools that can actually successfully deliver this? And I think that's something that we as a policy community have abysmally failed over the years to do, to our not to our credit. because then we sort of blame operations on having failed to do. So I think the first plea would be, we want to have a richer tool set. And I don't just mean a policy tool set. I mean an instrument set that allows us to deliver in a seamless real-time way. And that will involve real investments in technology that will allow us to tailor so that we don't have to go with kind of universal benefits. So that would be the first observation. And while I think we've performed well, I wouldn't say it's because we overly burdened our operators with modern technology that allowed them to succeed in that. But on the policy instrument choice, I think because of the significant disruption we're seeing in the crisis, and it's prognosticating on which of these things have changed everything and which of the things we think have changed everything are actually going to go back to normal afterwards. I think this is the kind of environment in which we need to have a much richer dialogue about what are the policy choices we want to have on the table and be able to make. And that is a natural time when you don't want to just rely on the wonderful expert people inside government. You want to open up to that broader conversation. So that would be a real pitch for this next phase. We want to really enrich that dialogue and understanding around it.
Graham, it's really been great to have you with us. I think you must be the busiest guy in Canada, so to give us 45 minutes of your time is really kind, and even more so your frankness and your bringing your experience to the table has really been a privilege for all of us who are listening, and for everyone who will watch this on the replay. So I want to just thank you very, very much. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been a real honor for me